of the American slaveholders, which was an ideology steeped in a racial hierarchy, and the Christianity of the Bible, which expressed a sense of liberation and equality among all peoples. But not everyone agrees with these distinctions. You see, many people see the word slave, and I did for a long time. They see the word slave in the Bible and read its associated passages and understandably envision the type of slavery that took place early on in the birth of this nation. Take, for example, the skeptic Sam Harris. He said, in assessing the moral wisdom of the Bible, it's useful to consider moral questions that have been solved to everyone's satisfaction. Consider the question of slavery. The entire civilized world now agrees that slavery is an abomination. What moral instruction do we get from the God of Abraham on this subject? Consult the Bible, and you'll discover that the creator of the universe clearly expects us to keep slaves. Clearly expects us to keep slaves. So that's the question that we're going to examine today. Now, as with many questions concerning the Bible, the responses are multifaceted due to the nature of the subject. And for this one in particular, there's sort of two camps that I've found whose hearts rest on this subject in different ways. You have one where there's this critically important emotional and historical element that for some people undergirds this question, perhaps for some of you in here today. And then you have others where it's strictly about some alleged textual issues inside the Bible or some perceived inaccuracies or inconsistencies in the character of God. Now, to begin addressing this issue, we need to do our best to understand what's actually meant by slavery to the writers of the Old Testament, since that's typically where the bulk of the objections derive. So to do this, having the proper context is really important. So as I mentioned before, in our 21st century minds, we automatically envision the kind of racially based slavery that Douglas described, the kind that was marked by the transatlantic slave trade, where Africans were kidnapped, families were forcibly ripped apart, women raped, sometimes also men and children were raped too, and men and women were worked and beaten mercilessly. All this and many more ghastly deeds were done under this notion that Africans were subhuman and therefore could be treated like chattel or mere property. But the Bible was different. In fact, many scholars agree that the Hebrew word that's translated as slave, ebed, E-B-E-D, or eved, E-V-E-D, is more reasonably translated as servant. Now, there's a few problems with how it's often translated. It has this incredibly negative connotation. Again, we naturally kind of think of this 21st century pre-Civil War slavery, and that colors our thinking about it. But before we dive into analyzing some of the biblical passages in question, I want to take sort of a sky-level view to look at three different systems of slavery really quick. And this chart is helpful. It's by Dr. Peter Williams. Now, I won't go through the whole chart. I just want to point out two things really quickly here. So this is a chart. It's a comparison of conditions in different slavery contexts. So, of course, you have Old Testament, what we read about in the Bible, the Roman slavery, and the slavery in this country. Now, take, for example, the first one, the holiday. So this just asks the question, okay, were slaves in this particular context given some type of religious holidays, or did they get some, I guess, quote-unquote, time off? So in Rome, you see that these slaves didn't, but in the Old Testament and in pre-Civil War slavery, you did. Now they did. Now, maybe you ask yourself, well, when did, I never heard about slaves getting any time off in pre-Civil War slavery. Well, there are instances, if you read the slave narratives, where they did get time during the Sabbath, okay, to worship. It may have been just a short amount of time, but they did get some time, a small amount, to themselves. I'm not sure how widespread it was, but some have talked about that. But then one scholar says this about the Old Testament holidays. He says, servants took part in religious ceremonies, all of which awarded vacation days, which in a 50-year period totaled 23 years and 64 days off. And if anyone wants those passages in the Bible, there's some from Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus. I'd be glad to give you those afterwards. And then the other thing I wanted to point out is if you look at the last four categories, all the way from kidnap to physical abuse, you see here that these things weren't condoned in the Old Testament, but of course they were in the Roman and the pre-Civil War slavery. Okay, so now let's get to some passages. Let's look quickly at a couple different aspects of slavery, or rather servanthood, in the Bible, and juxtapose it with 17th century antebellum slavery. So first off, let's look at the motivation. The motivation for antebellum slavery, okay? The motivation was vastly different. Antebellum slavery was again predicated off this notion, or this idea, that Africans were subhuman and could be treated like property. Moreover, they were involuntarily forced into slavery, usually through kidnapping. And this practice was prohibited in the Bible, as shown in Exodus chapter 21, verse 16, which states, "Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death." So we see that kidnapping in the Old Testament is so serious that it's punishable by death. In fact, Hebrew scholar Walter Kaiser notes, kidnapping is not a property offense, since no property offense draws a capital punishment. And this law is not listed under property laws. Instead, it's the theft of a human being. In the Bible, though, slavery or servanthood was typically motivated out of an economic necessity. Therefore, it was voluntary. Whereas the other one was involuntary, this one was usually voluntary. Now, those who incurred debts for various reasons would sell themselves into slavery to pay them off, which would be akin to what we know as indentured servitude. In fact, furthermore, during the pre-Civil War slavery, slaves were never set free. In fact, their offspring would often be subjected to lifelong slavery. But again, juxtaposing this pre-Civil War against the slavery that's described in the Bible, Hebrew slaves or servants were to be released after 6 years. So it was more of a contractual agreement. So in Exodus chapter 21, verse 2, it says, "When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the seventh he shall go out for free, for nothing." And then check this out. Even after that happens, when a person is released, look at what happens in Deuteronomy. So in Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 14, it states, "You must supply them generously." So you is referring to the slave master. "You must supply them generously from your flock, from your threshing floor, and from your winepress. Just as the Lord your God has blessed you, you must give to them." So we see this extension of compassion even in this regulation that we just wouldn't find in antebellum slavery. Moreover, remember, this person likely became a slave out of economic necessity. So furnishing this person with some capital actually encouraged economic independence. As Gary North observed, this short-term indentured servitude was designed to produce long-term independence. Now, it's important to note that there were different levels of regulation and limitations for non-Hebrew slaves, okay? So, and if you want to ask questions about that, we can talk about that more in Q&A. However, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the Bible still takes time to outline standards of proper treatment of foreign slaves. And in ancient Near East culture, even the mention of a difference in regulations for foreign slaves meant that the Bible was providing a clear safeguard against the mistreatment of people regardless of race or religion. So what we see here is the building blocks for universal human rights. So we talked about motivation. Now let's talk about the treatment. So how was the treatment of slaves? Now, in pre-Civil War slavery, slaves, again, were regarded as chattel or mere property and were treated as such. They were stripped down naked for examination, males, female, and children. They were set up and sold on auction blocks. They often had heavy chains around their ankles, wrists, and necks to try and prevent them from escaping. As I mentioned before, slaves were mercilessly whipped for any and everything. Women slaves were mercilessly raped in what former slave Harriet Jacobs described as the most intimate form of humiliation. And slaves were maimed and murdered without any consequence to the master. But in the Bible, we find a revolutionary concept that slaves were actually to be treated as people with dignity, not mere property, unlike slavery in other cultures of that time period. So, for example, we see in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 53 through 54, it states, he shall treat him as a worker hired year by year. He shall not rule ruthlessly over him in your sight. And if he is not redeemed by these means, then he and his children with him shall be released in the year of Jubilee. And for example, we see in Exodus chapter 21, verse 20, that if a master harms his slave or servant to the point of death, he is also to be put to death. And later on in that same chapter, there are other types of harm that are described, and there's some associated consequences for doing those things. But just looking at another civilization during that time, we have Babylon, and perhaps you heard of the Babylonian Hammurabi Code. And here you see laws based on one's social status. So in the case of slaves who are on sort of the lower rung of society, harm was not restricted, but it was actually promoted. And this included physical harm such as rape and mutilation. Furthermore, consider how runaways were treated in the Old Testament versus the pre-Civil War slavery. So in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 15 through 16, it says, "You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place that he shall choose within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. You shall not wrong him." So again, we see this level of consideration and human decency that was flagrantly absent in antebellum slavery. And by the way, if you were wondering how this would be treated in pre-Civil War slavery, what would be done was that there would be a prison sentence of 6 months, or there would be a fine of about $1,000. But let's take a closer look and check out the South Carolina Slave Code of 1740. Forgive me, this is a longer quote, but I think it's important, again, for understanding the difference between runaways in both of these systems. It says, "It shall be further enacted by the authority aforesaid, that if any slave who shall be out of the house or plantation where such slave shall live, or shall be usually employed, or without some whiter person in company with such slave, shall refuse to submit or undergo the examination of any white person, it shall be lawful for any such white person to pursue, apprehend, and moderately correct such slave. And if any such slave shall assault and strike such white person, such slave may be lawfully killed." Moreover, in the law code of Hammurabi, we find another example of rewards for escaped slaves. So in Law 17, it says, "If anyone find a runaway male or female slave in the open country, they're to bring them to their masters, and the master of their slaves will give them 2 shekels of silver." But even though many times the tension of understanding slavery in the Bible is sort of situated in the Old Testament, there's also some parts of the New Testament that bring up questions. So Howard Thurman was a man, a pastor, a fantastic Christian writer, whom Martin Luther King Jr. greatly admired. And he wrote a book here called Jesus and the Disinherited. And in this book, he argued that at the crux of Jesus' religion was his care for the less fortunate. Now, in it, he details a conversation with his grandmother, former slave Nancy Ambrose, in which she recalls some painful memories in the words of New Testament writer Paul, which were used as reinforcement for her slavery. She said, "During the days of slavery, the master's minister would occasionally hold services for the slaves. At least 4 or 5 times a year, he used as a text, "Slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters. I promised my Maker that if I ever learned to read and if freedom ever came, I would not read that part of the Bible." It goes without saying that the psychological effects of the oppressive, racially based antebellum slavery were no doubt pervasive. And here we see this tense relationship with some of Paul's words. Now let me back up a bit and explain just a little bit about the Bible in case you aren't aware. So the Bible, again, is a bunch of letters written to various churches during the beginning of Christianity, and many of those letters were written by Paul in order to teach, encourage, correct, and for other reasons as well. Now, one of these letters has some pretty significant implications for today's talk, because we have a letter that was written by one of the leaders of the Christian movement, Paul, to a slave owner about a slave. And his letter, of course, is called Philemon. Now, the letter to Philemon is very short, but again, I think it's very, very impactful, particularly for this talk today. So for context, Paul writes a letter to Philemon, the slave owner, on behalf of his slave, Onesimus. Now, Paul writes this letter from jail, but he had a previous encounter with Onesimus, again, the slave, in which Onesimus actually became a Christian. So Paul, again, is writing this letter to Philemon, who's also a Christian, to now receive Onesimus back as a brother and not merely as a slave. Now, this letter here in the Bible, amongst other things, was used by pre-Civil War, pro-slavery advocates as leverage for their cause. Philemon became a representative for the modern-day so-called Christian slave owner, and it was used as political propaganda and motivation in such cases as the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which mandated that all escaped slaves be returned to their masters. Now, this argument is sometimes made. All right, here we go. We good. All right, this argument is sometimes made that since Paul didn't explicitly condemn slavery and demand Onesimus' freedom, he therefore must be pro-slavery. Well, I think that's false for a number of reasons. So number one, not speaking out against something doesn't mean necessarily that you're for it. So I have 3 children. My oldest, Braden, is 9 years old. And I've had a lot of talks about a lot of different things with him. Talked to him about making sure he makes his bed in the morning and making sure he cleans up, after himself when he eats. But one talk that we haven't had is about him taking my car and going out for a spin in Detroit. Now, just because we haven't had that talk doesn't mean that I'm for it. So an argument from silence isn't necessarily an argument of support. Let me say that again. An argument from silence isn't necessarily an argument of support. So second of all, if you pay close attention to the language that Paul uses throughout this letter, he uses this language that has this bond of familial love or family love. So he uses words such as son, child, father, and brother, all during his pleas to Philemon to receive Onesimus back. Now, you'd be hard-pressed to find any of those type of words used from a slave master to a slave during pre-Civil War slavery. So, for example, in Philemon chapter 1, verses 15 through 16, he says, "For this perhaps is why he was parted from you for a while, that you might have him back forever, no longer as a bondservant, but more than a bondservant, as a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord." Again, you would simply never find this language used to characterize a relationship between a slave and his or her owner in pre-Civil War slavery. So third, finally here, although Paul doesn't plainly and overtly, explicitly rebuke slavery, he implicitly denounces it through his appeals. You see, Paul made it clear that he could have asserted his authority with Philemon, but he didn't think the best way to do it was through coercion. He said, therefore, although in Christ I could be bold and order you to do what you ought to do, yet I prefer to appeal to you on the basis of love. You see, love isn't truly love, of course, when it's forced. And Paul had a bigger goal in mind, and that was the transformation of Philemon's heart. And the transformation of his heart and the transformation of the heart of other slave owners would cause a system like slavery to crumble. You know, I like how Dr. Eric Mason put it when he explains why Paul first goes for Philemon's heart instead of directly rebuking the actual system of slavery. Mason says, because the heart is where the system is created and upheld. Now, a little earlier, I read a quote from former slave Nancy Ambrose, and in that quote, she mentioned the verse from Ephesians. I'll read out that verse really quick. It's Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5. She said, slaves, be obedient to those who are your earthly masters, with fear and trembling and singleness of heart, as to Christ. Now, there's also a parallel, perhaps more well-known verse in Colossians, and it says, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything you do. Try to please them all the time, not just when they are watching you. Serve them sincerely because of your reverent fear of the Lord. Now, I don't know about you, but when I ring it, that has the ring of oppressive language. But one thing we must always remember is to read within the full context. So, for example, if you stop there, again, it sounds oppressive, it sounds horrible. But if you read further in verse 9, this is what it states. It says, and masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. So the picture that Paul is painting, when you read further, takes on a much different light if you understand the context. He points out that both master and slaves are subject to their shared heavenly Father. Now let me say a quick word about favoritism and how it relates to this discussion of slavery. Throughout this talk, as you've probably noticed, again, I'm drawing some distinctions between pre-Civil War slavery and the slavery in the Bible. But in the book of James, he talks about favoritism or perhaps partiality. Now, all that means, of course, is unfair bias. So I think you can see how racism is easily tied to this concept. Now, James gives a great example for us to actually think about what partiality means. So he gives this example. There's this one guy that walks in, nice clothes, suited and booted, looking real good. And then there's this other guy who's dressed rather shabby. But because the one man is dressed nicely, they show him preferential treatment. So listen to what James says in chapter 2, verse 8 about this. He says, if you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, and that royal law being you shall love your neighbor as yourself, then you're doing well. But if you show partiality, again, based on these frivolous external qualities, then you're committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. So it's clear here how God views the sin of racism. But there's another passage that lets you know just how disgusted God is with racism and the various types of slavery within the antebellum period. In Proverbs verse 6, the writer lists seven things that are detestable to the Lord. These are haughty eyes, feelings of arrogance or superiority, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush to evil, a false witness who pours out lies, and a person who stirs up conflict in the community. I think you'd easily find that all 7 of those things, again, that are detestable to the Lord, were intrinsically and explicitly found in pre-Civil War slavery, but were not inherently found in the servitude of the Bible. Now, again, there's some other passages that perhaps we can talk about in Q&A. But I want to be crystal clear on this point. Even though I've elucidated some passages and shown this stark difference again between pre-Civil War slavery and the slavery described in the Bible, I want to be clear that this description of slavery in the Bible was not at all ideal. This was not part of God's original plan. You see, these were not universal moral laws that God gave. Instead, these were more referred to as like case laws. So these were laws based on a certain situation for the people of Israel. So it's similar to how divorce seemed permissible in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, Jesus explains that the reason for that was because of the hardness of man's hearts. But he goes on to clarify that that's not how it was from the beginning. So in other words, as Dr. Esau Macaulay stated, he said the regulations put forth to govern slavery in the Bible was God's attempt to mitigate the impact of human sin. Furthermore, we see examples in the Old Testament of the times when a chattel type of slavery was in effect. Look at the consequences of that. So one, God punished King Ahaz for enslaving captives, and that's in 2 Chronicles. Jeremiah spoke against the people not granting freedom to servants as the Pentateuch required, and that was in Jeremiah chapter 34. Samuel's argument against getting a king in Israel is based on the oppression of tyrannical kings in ancient Near Eastern culture. That's in 1 Samuel. And by insisting on a king in Israel, Samuel argues that they will become the slaves, which would be clearly wrong. But despite the hardness of the hearts of the slave owners, interestingly, many slaves, like Douglas, recognize, again, this difference between the two. You see, there's this notion among some people that because the slaves adopted this religion of their masters, they adopted it because it was forced upon them. But that couldn't be further from the truth. And even a cursory reading of the slave narratives or Negro spirituals will prove this point. So there's this one called Slavery Chained, and it goes, slavery chained and broke at last, broke at last, broke at last. Slavery chained and broke at last, I'm going to praise God till I die. Way down in that valley, praying on my knees, told God about my troubles and to help me if he please. I did know my Jesus heard me because the Spirit spoke to me and said, rise, my child, your children and you shall be set free. I done picked one mighty captain for to marshal all my hosts and to bring my bleeding ones to me, and not one shall be lost. Slavery chained and broke at last, broke at last, broke at last. Slavery chained and broke at last. I'm going to praise God till I die. Now, this spiritual was said to be written in 1865, the year slavery legally ended by the ratification of the 13th Amendment. So for 246 years, Africans were kidnapped, thrust into brutal, dehumanizing slavery, and was told by their captors that the Bible foretold of their current predicament. But the slaves didn't buy that. You see, instead, they came to know a God who the psalmist said was close to the brokenhearted and would save those whose spirits was crushed. A God who cared about justice and freed the Israelites from the bondage of the Egyptians. A God filled with compassion who literally wept at man's misery. A God who chose an enslaved people to be his people. And a God who wasn't aloof but could intimately understand their suffering because his son, Jesus, suffered a great deal as well. All right, so now I'm probably going to show my age a little bit here, but who recognizes this? Ma'am? What is it? Say it aloud? Viewmaster, okay. How many of y'all didn't know what that was? All right, ain't nobody gonna admit it. It's funny, when I speak and do this talk with like high schoolers, they're like, what is that ancient toy there? So again, this is a Viewmaster. So for me, growing up in the early 80s, this was like my virtual reality, for what they have now. So again, you have this handheld red device, and of course, you have these cardboard, we don't even use cardboard hardly anymore, but cardboard cartridges. And and each one of those discs contain images going around them. So if you just take that disc and you look at it outside of its context, it looked quite blurry and quite peculiar. But when you take those discs and you put them in their proper context within that viewmaster, the image became quite beautiful. And that's what it was like for many of the slaves. You see, they were told this one story of the God who condoned their enslavement, but as they learned to read and experience him, the true God of the Bible, the God that Douglas described as the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ, came into focus. So let me ask you all a question today. What picture of Jesus do you have right now? You see, we often have this misconception that Christianity is just another religion filled with a bunch of do's and don'ts, a bunch of things to check off, and just a bunch of rules to adhere by. But that couldn't be further from the truth. You see, most, if not all, of the other world religions say, if you obey, then you'll be accepted. But Christianity says something different. You see, it says, since you are accepted, then you will obey. You see, we don't have to do anything to earn Christ's love. So perhaps through this talk and the couple that came before me, the true Jesus is starting to come into focus for you. But suppose you're still questioning who he is. Well, you're not alone. You see, Jesus asked some of his followers in Mark 8:29 the same question. You see, they were taking a stroll to a village, and Jesus asked them two questions. The first one he asked them was, well, who do people say that I am? And they gave a couple of the more popular responses around town. And then he asked, but who do you say that I am? And Peter responded in saying, you are the Christ. You see, Jesus had revealed enough about himself to them so that they can understand who he was, and those same revelations apply to us today. Through his own words about himself, saying things like, I and the Father are one, and using phrases like Son of Man, these all attested to someone with divine authority. His actions of healing and forgiving sins, something that only a God could do, and his fulfilled prophecy that he would die and rise from the dead. See, Jesus places an immense value on all of us by coming to earth to live among humanity and to sacrifice himself for us. You know, my friend and colleague, Abdul Murray, he says it like this. He said that if a thing's value is determined by what someone is willing to pay for it, then Christ paid an immeasurable value for each one of you on the cross. And I think this is the ultimate challenge to past and present questions about equal value and dignity of all of humanity. Regardless of race, of any ethnicities, Jesus sacrificed his life to bring justice for all. Thank you. Okay, so now I think we're going to open it up for Q&A. A man in the back there. Oh, he's still going, so you can go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for your discussion.
Oh, thank you.
Let's see. I kind of wanted to move a little bit past the slavery and talk about reparations and how, if that's okay, like, you know,
Yeah.
just in the fact that we know clearly slavery happened, right? You know, it happened, it was horrible. But now we're dealing with, you know, this new presidency, you know, the debates coming up, and what's really on my heart is when are we going to really honestly talk about reparations, right? When are we going to really honestly talk about how the effects of slavery, right? Just for one simple thing, the punishment for education, right? Being maimed or even killed, right, for that. And we see now that a large portion of African Americans are lacking in education. So we have these direct reflections that go back to things that happened in slavery.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that? Do you, because I love the topic, but we know, there was slavery in the Bible. We get that, especially us, everybody. But people, brown skin, we know what's going on. Like, and we know that the word was used in a wrong way to keep us binded. So It's a great topic, but we know, we can. So now let's talk about reparations. Let's talk about, some of the effects of slavery and how it is in our present day right now.
Yeah. May I ask your name?
My name is William.
William, thank you.
Love, yeah.
All right, thank you, William. I appreciate the question. So you're going to start off with the easy question. Supposed to get softballs at the beginning, what is the Bible, No. No, I appreciate that, William. As a ministry, I have to give sort of a disclaimer. Like I said, I've only been here since April, so I'm not trying to get fired already. No, seriously though, we don't talk about, we're careful about how we step into politics, okay? So I'll say that before I give kind of my answer here. As far as reparations is concerned, and perhaps you or perhaps others saw that there was, I think it was either earlier this week or last week, the House had they had Ta-Nehisi Coates in to speak to this issue, and I think perhaps, what's his name? I think Danny Glover might have been there as well. So whenever I think we look at social issues, we have to be really careful. Whenever we have to determine our sociology must always be firmly rooted in our theology, okay? And I think it's easy for us all of us to get caught up in social issues and not first ask, okay, what is the Bible? As a Christian, what am I, as an African-American Christian, what does this mean, I do think that reparations just mean repairing, right? I mean, that's part of justice, So I do think that reparations is, there is a biblical mandate for it, okay? And as far as in general, and I'll come back to you in just 1 second here. If you look at other people groups, like the Japanese who suffered, who were in the internment camps in this country, the Native Americans, we all, at least to a certain degree, know about the horrors, the absolute horrors that they were subjected to. They received a level of reparations. Now, a separate argument could be had, were those reparations sufficient? That's a separate.
They got something.
Yeah, they got something. I don't want to speak on behalf of my Native American brothers and sisters. I'm just stating sort of, and then even yes, the Jews as well. That's what I was going to mention. So I think there's a mandate for it. I probably better leave it at that because I don't want to get too overly political.
And I thank you for even saying that. I think that right now when we just talk about the present climate, we want to make sure that we're current, right? Like, what I'm saying?
Right.
We're kind of woke on certain situations
Yep.
that, affect us. And what I was just kind of saying is that I think somewhere in the Bible, they have certain rules. If you steal this, you're paid this, if you do that, and so it just dawned on me, well, hey, we can kind of correlate it when we say, was slavery in the Bible or was it permitted? What did we say about the atrocities that happened then? What was the repayment for that? I graduated from Howard University, and I know Howard Thurman, hate you. I know that, Howard Thurman was over the School of Divinity there. And so I'm very familiar with that. A lot of times I think that what happens is this is such a great platform like Blueprint Church, right, to have different races and backgrounds coming to hear certain things. I think it's just very important that we have each other's back, right? Whatever race it is that we have to understand that, there was a portion of time where African Americans were so much thrown under the bus that that we still have these scars from that, and the scars are so deep that they're affecting us in our present day. And so if we're comrading with my green brother and my purple brother and my white brother, I want them to have my back, right? I want them to know what I've gone through and to not just write it off. Like, I grew up in Denver, and it was very hard. The last thing I'll say, it was very hard. I didn't really learn about this or become so passionate about it until I went to Howard, because because I didn't get this in the history books in my high school or in middle school.
Yeah.
This is something that happened to my people.
Yeah. No, first of all, William, I appreciate that passion. What you said, a couple of things that you said, I just want to say a couple quick things, and I'll go to the gentleman in the back there. What you said about the pain and the suffering in particular, I don't think that enough attention is given to that. I mean, if you think about it, there's a book, an entire book of the Bible that deals with pain and suffering and grief. It's called Lamentations. So obviously, if God saw fit to make sure that one entire book of the Bible or letter of the Bible dealt with this subject, then it's something that we need to deal with. I mean, if you look at the Psalms, you see the psalmist crying about all different types of things. Jeremiah, one of the prophets of the Old Testament, he was known as the weeping prophet because of how much he was in agony over what he knew was going to befall Jerusalem. So the pain and anguish part is very valid. And then I believe it's John chapter 13, where it says that they will know, they meaning the world, they will know that you are my disciples by the love that you have for one another, or by the way that you treat one another, depending on the translation. So I think that, coupled with the fact that Paul also states that as Christians we have a ministry of reconciliation, that means that we should come alongside our brothers and sisters. And if, our greatest, he's telling you right there, what's your greatest evangelism tool? Loving one another, acting as one, acting as the body of Christ. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to agree on all things. Of course not. But if we can come alongside each other and say, hey, I may not agree with you fully, but at least, I feel you. At least I can at least appreciate where you're coming from, and I can understand you a bit further. I'm going to say one more thing, and then I don't want to take up too much time from this gentleman. There's just a Christian giant. What is his name now? He wrote, I don't know why I'm blanking on his name. He wrote, John Perkins. And you ever heard of John Perkins? Anyone ever heard of John Perkins? Okay. Yeah, I'm getting some nods. So his last book he wrote was One Blood. He said that was his last book. Then I saw him at a conference. He said he'd write one more. So he got me to buy that one. No, it's good, though. It's good. You should check it out. But in it he recites this African proverb. And it goes like this. He said, when I saw you from afar, I thought you were a monster. When you came closer, I saw that you were an animal. When you came even closer, I saw that you were a human. And when we came face to face, I realized that you were my brother. And what I think he's saying there is that, essentially, is that proximity breeds understanding. So the more that we get closer, and I'm not talking about proximity this side of the stage, this side of the stage. I mean us getting closer, like you mentioned, and understanding one another. I think that will help, and that will be key to us moving forward together, as brothers and sisters in Christ. I mean, if we think about it, in Revelations, that's what we're going to see, right? In Revelations chapter 7, verse 9, it doesn't say that, John's vision doesn't say that there's this big, colorless sea of believers or this group of people. No, he gets specific. He says every tribe, every nation, every tongue, every language will all be seated before the Lord. So I hope that's a little bit of an answer. So this gentleman in the back there.
Yeah, thanks for your talk, man. It's been good.
Thanks, sir.
That quote by Frederick Douglass, it talked about the two distinctive Christianities, the one he said was evil and the one that was pure.
Yes, sir.
So my question is, today, how does one ensure, because I think both, in every generation, you got the false and you got the true,
yes,
but I think that one that was birthed out of the slave times, I think it's still present to some degree. How does one ensure that they don't inherit that particular Christianity, and as opposed to the true Christianity? And what would it look like today a Christianity? I know it wouldn't be as explicit because we don't have slaves, but how would that defiled so-called, what my man was talking about, the one that's impure, how would that look today as opposed to contrasting with a pure Christianity?
Okay, and what's your name, sir?
Kenny.
Pardon me?
Kenny.
Ken?
Yeah, Ken. Yeah, that's
Okay,
cool.
nice. I probably didn't hear, my bad. Thank you. I appreciate the questions. I might have to ask you for that second one again. So the first one, just to make sure I understand, the first one was, what does those two Christianities that Frederick Douglass talked about?
Right.
What were those? Is that what
No,
you're
not what were they, but like today, how would
Oh, what
one?
would- oh.
Yeah, today, how would one? Because we inherit our Christian faith. I know we're born into the faith through faith in Jesus Christ, but you kind of inherit the faith that's been, posterity-wise from generations before us.
Right, so how do you distinguish between
how
the
do you
two?
distinguish the two
Got you.
today in our day and age?
Okay, got you. Appreciate that clarification. Yeah, man, that's a great question. It's interesting because up in Detroit, I don't know the demographics down here as far as particularly Afrocentric religions, but we have quite a few up there. We have like the Nation of Islam, which was sort of started there. And then we also have, who's been on the ride, is our Black Hebrew Israelite brothers and sisters. And they look at different Christianity, different types of ways. So what I always say is this. One of the talks that I actually gave it last week on Is Christianity the White Man's Religion? I looked at it in three different ways, or from three different perspectives, or at least the three different ways and major ways in which it's been perpetuated. So one is historically. So historically, how is Christianity the white man's religion? How has that been perpetuated? And I look at sociologically how it's been perpetuated. So historically, I would say that it's been perpetuated by saying, again, and I mentioned it here, and I think you mentioned it, that, y'all are fools because you just adopting this religion that was forced upon you, and your ancestors were enslaved because of it. And that's foolish. That's sort of the African American context. In the African context, historically, it's perpetuated by saying that Christianity only came to Africa through European colonialism and imperialism and through the missionaries. I think both of those are false. Number one, historically, as far as the Africans, that's not right, because actually Africa, anybody ever heard the Christian rapper Reflect? Okay, he has a line in his song King. He says, "White man's religion, that's just fake news. The cross was in Africa for Europe even knew." And I think that was on point because Christianity was in Africa hundreds of years before it even came to Europe. You have one of the writers of the Bible, one of the Gospel, John Mark, he was from Cyrene. Cyrene is historically an African country. You have some of the church fathers. You've probably heard of Augustine. You've probably heard of Alexander, Origen, Cyprius, all of these different church fathers who helped elucidate some of these doctrines of Christianity that we now can appreciate. Well, these are all North Africans, okay? And often, if you go on Amazon right now, or if you go on Barnes and Nobles or anything like that, you'll often see them depicted as looking European, okay? Now so historically, that's part of that piece. Sociologically, part of what I was saying there about the imagery, if you look at that, and then you look at all these pictures of Jesus being white, all of this, and so historically, sorry, I want to keep this short, but it's a good question. I'm gonna stay around and answer as many questions as you guys have, even if we shut down here. But so around the early 19th century, there were these three Christian organizations that came that came about, It was the American Tract Society, the American Sunday School Union, and I think the American Baptist something. I can't remember the last part of it. And they, all three of them, again, this is the early 1900s, before the Emancipation Proclamation, 13th Amendment, all those types of things. So again, we're living in a country that's still very steeped in racism, okay? Overt racism and slavery, I should say. Now, those three organizations had this shared goal, and this goal was to create a Jesus or a Christ-centered identity throughout the nation. You might say, well, what's wrong with that? That's we believe that Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, and so getting that word out there. And the way that they were going to do it was through distributing tracts. They literally distributed millions upon millions of tracts over several years. Now, the thing about these tracts was that they had images of a white Jesus. Again, if you think about the context of the country, think about the psychological and sociological effects that had particularly on African Americans if they're seeing that they're associating a white Jesus, okay, and their oppressors at that time, being white, they're drawing this association. In fact, a notable former slave, Henry Brown, better known as Henry Box Brown, you probably heard of him. He escaped slavery by literally putting himself inside of a box. Yeah, learned about him like back in, 6th, 7th grade. But he said that he began, in his slave narrative, he said that he began to see his old master as God and his young master as Jesus. Anybody know Good Times, the show Good Times? See, this is my crowd. Y'all know everything I'm talking about here. So, if you remember the episode with Black Jesus on the wall, now JJ, it's a funny, of course, it's good, it's funny, but I think it does show this important sociological, psychological effect with that imagery, because JJ had painted, quote unquote, Black Jesus. Now we know it ended up being just a wino, but he had painted, at that time we thought it was just Black Jesus, but Florida had this picture of white Jesus on her wall, and she said, this is the only Jesus I've known, this is what's been in my family since my birth, I don't want that one. So I guess that goes to show, again, in a funny way, the psychological and social effects. So to your question about the truth, and then theologically, we have the curse of Ham in Genesis 9. I'll talk about that real quick, and then I'll end here. But in Genesis 9, you have the situation where Noah and his family, they've settled. Noah has planted this vineyard. Obviously, he's liked this vineyard a bit too much because he's gotten drunk and passed out. And so one of his sons, Ham, goes over and sees somehow he's passed out and he's naked. The Bible doesn't talk about how he got naked. I don't know. Obviously, he had some pretty good wine. But Ham came over and saw him naked. And the first thing he did was he went over and told his two brothers, Shem and Japheth, what he saw. Now, Shem and Japheth's reaction was to go over there and not look at him, but cover him with a garment. Now, when Noah awoke, he was understandably upset at this, and he immediately cursed Ham's youngest son, Canaan, and he blessed Shem and Japheth. Now, this became known as, of course, the curse of Ham, particularly amongst pro-slavery advocates, and it was in the Bible, the old Scofield Bible, one of the most sought-after evangelical reference Bibles in history, had this myth in the Bible, okay? And many other Bibles had this myth in there. And they said that since he cursed him, and since black people are now cursed with darker skin, that's where that derived from. And they said that, and pro-slavery advocates would say that blacks were in their proper context as slaves because Noah cursed them, and whites come from the line of Japheth, and so since he blessed them, they were suited to be the masters. So these were the type of lies, historically, sociologically, and theologically, that were told, and why a lot of people, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, some people who I know and love personally, they have a hard time embracing Christianity. So how do we then fight against that? I think by knowing the truth. Some of the things I just talked about, what's the truth about the historical, the history of Christianity, particularly God's plan, how African people have been used in God's plan. And that's not to say that African people are of more worth than non-African people during the biblical story. Of course not. That's not at all. Everyone is of equal worth, made in the image of God. But it's important when discussing this particular issue with our African American brothers and sisters to say, this was your role in God's redemptive plan. This is your ancestors' role in God's redemptive plan, and speak to that question or concern about identity. So anyway, I hope that answer helps a little bit there. If not, we could talk some more after. Thanks.
Okay. What is the church's, and furthermore, the believers' practical role in relation to broken and lower income communities? I know we must share the gospel and let those building blocks fall into place, but is there more?
Okay, and what's your name?
Shalise.
Shalise? Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Shalise. If y'all didn't get it, I'm going to ask everybody for their name. So, but no, I appreciate the question. So what is the church's role in sort of coming alongside those in low-income housing? Is that what you said?
And just broken communities.
Oh, in broken communities, excuse me, okay. That's a great question. Again, as I mentioned earlier to William here, our sociology must always be firmly rooted first in our theology. And I think if you look at the Bible, I think you see that God has a particular concern, especially for the poor, for the oppressed. I mean, I was just talking to Tia here earlier, and she was going through the Old Testament, and I was talking about the minor prophets. If you look at the minor prophets, I think they get kind of the short end of the stick just by being called the minor prophets, because they have some pretty major things to say to me. Because the things that they really talk about, I think, show the heart of who God is. And they talk about the oppressed. And if you think about like Micah and Obadiah and all of these other prophets, they really speak to the oppression. And then in the New Testament, you have instances where Jesus, he not only attends to the spiritual needs, but there's also an attentiveness oftentimes to the physical needs. And oftentimes, I sometimes work with Crew. Anybody ever heard of the Christian organization Crew? I work with the inner city Crew up in Detroit. And there's obviously a lot of brokenness in our community up there. There's a lot of beautiful things as well, but there's a lot of brokenness. And oftentimes we go out and give food as well as give the gospel and just talk to them about, okay, what's on your heart? What's your concern? How can we as a church come alongside you and help you? So a lot of times, again, I think that there needs to be attention to both the physical and the spiritual need. Sometimes I do see that we can get lost in just the social aspect, and so we'll think too much, I won't say too much, but just solely about just attending to the physical needs. Again, that's incredibly important. I can't emphasize that enough. But if we consider the eternal value as well, then we have to consider that as equally important. There's a magician. He's a part of the act of Penn and Teller. Perhaps you guys have heard of Penn and Teller. And he is a stark atheist, okay? And he has a video on YouTube. I would invite everyone to go check it out. It's called The Gift of the Bible. It's only about 5 or 6 minutes long. It's called The Gift of the Bible. He was talking about how he did this one magic set, and he was up on stage, and afterwards a gentleman came up to him and gave him a Bible. He said, "Listen, man, I know that you don't believe in God. I know you think it's silly, but I just feel like I have to give this to you, because I love you." And he said, "You know what I appreciated about that? Because for Christians, if they truly believe what they say they believe, to not share it would be utterly cruel." That's coming from an atheist, okay? So I think, and again, that's just to undergird the eternal, the giving of the gospel as well. So I think that both of those things do go hand in hand. As far as what that looks like in particular communities, I think it differs depending on what the needs are of those communities. But I think that it's definitely the church should be at the forefront of that. One more quick thing that just came to mind. There's a sociologist. His name is Rodney Stark. He's written a bunch of books. I don't even think he's a Christian. He may be, but anyway, one of his books is called "The Rise of Christianity," and he says that early on in the Christian faith, when Christianity saw its largest sort of boom, was when Christians were actually attending to the needs of others. Others would come and say, they would obviously be appreciative, but they'd also say, "Why do you do that?" And they would say, "Well, because of the God that I serve, because of the grace and the mercy that he's bestowed on me, how much more so should I bestow that grace and mercy and help you as a fellow image bearer of God?" So I hope that's a little helpful there. Somebody else had a question? Oh, this lady right here.
Hi, I was just going to say that Kenny's question and your question get really tied together. As a white lady, I would say that how it shows itself today is we don't know information also. We were not told stuff. Like you weren't told about the slave stuff, and I knew about it but did not learn in high school and only recently really learned the Jim Crow stuff. And so the wrong thinking church today is when people say, "Oh, slavery was 150 years ago, get over it." And it's like, no, the poverty and the things we see today. I mean, I freaked out when I'm from California. When I moved to Texas, I could not believe that during my lifetime, my lady friends I was sitting with had been in separate restrooms and separate drinking fountains. I mean, like, I could not believe it. And so how would that not affect? How did not, what did they think when they were little kids? What did their moms tell them? Right. It is today, and yeah, we don't have the horrible stuff, but that it affects everything. And so to know that it's that close, and so I just think it's education for people to know the history.
Yeah, thank you. What's your name? Patty? Okay, yeah, thank you. Patty. Yeah, no, I agree. Education is definitely a huge part of it. I mean, the truth of the matter is, we can't all be knowledgeable about everything, so we do have to share. We have to be open to listening to and perhaps having some of our views changed or challenged a bit. So yeah, racism is still the effects of racism, overt, I would say, acts of racism like slavery and Jim Crow. You have sundown towns, you have convict leasing, and many other things that I can name still have an effect.
Well,
today.
right. Oh,
we got time for one more question, and then we'll dismiss. But Brandon's going to stick around, so if you have questions, certainly come up and talk. But we'll one more question right here.
To William's question that he was talking about reparations, I feel like as a people, we do have to be careful about when it comes to reparations, because I think as long as people are looking for a check, that I don't think that that's the thing it's not gonna end up helping everything. And I feel like as far as what he's saying too, knowing our history and as Christians coming along and helping, not helping, but coming along and really doing our part as being disciples and teaching about the gospel, I feel like is something that will also help as far as when the talk comes up about reparations.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Can I just say one thing that I think that what looks like today when you were talking about how, I forget what quote it was, but how a white person could, could come and reprimand a slave, and if a slave, hit, well, we see it now in police brutality, right? We see it now, in the effects of how we're treated, just by authorities. That has a lot to do with it. And I also say that we don't necessarily need a check, but I do believe that the things that we were taken away from us, like education, we should be able to go to school for free. I do believe like healthcare, we should be able to have healthcare for free. These things that were taken away from us, I think if you want to repair this nation, if you really want to, say more than an apology to the people that built up this nation, then give those things so that we don't have to, go out and rob, steal, and kill to get them. That's just my point or thought.
Thank you. Well said.
Thanks, William. Thanks for sharing.
Well, thank you all. I appreciate you all.